The day began like any other Saturday in Brookhaven, a quiet little town nestled between rolling hills and sprawling fields. The early summer sun warmed the air, and the gentle breeze carried the smell of blooming wildflowers mixed with the unmistakable aroma of sizzling meat. Families gathered in the local park for the annual community barbecue, a tradition as old as the town itself. The scene was picture perfect, kids laughing as they chased each other across the open lawn, neighbors chatting over picnic tables laden with homemade dishes, and the steady rhythm of burgers flipping on the grill. Sitting off to the side, by one of the smaller grills, was Jack Mercer. At first glance, he blended in easily with the crowd. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his face lined with years of experience, and his simple outfit, jeans, a flannel shirt, and well-worn boots, gave him the look of a man who preferred life's quieter moments. Jack wasn't the type to seek attention. He mostly kept to himself, only ever speaking when spoken to. When he did talk, his voice was calm, measured, with a tone that made people feel comfortable, though they couldn't quite explain why. Jack had moved to Brookhaven a year ago, renting a modest house at the edge of town. He quickly became known as the quiet widower. His wife had passed away several years ago, though Jack rarely spoke about it. The neighbors respected his privacy. They'd wave at him as he worked in his garden or fixed something on his porch, but they didn't pry. People liked Jack. He was polite, always ready to lend a hand if someone needed it. Yet, there was something about him, something subtle but undeniable, that made you feel like there was more to his story. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Even when he was sitting still, there was an unmistakable air of control about him. His shoulders were broad, his posture straight, and his movements deliberate, as if he was always aware of his surroundings. His eyes, a sharp steel gray, seemed to notice everything, though he rarely commented on what he saw. To the folks in Brookhaven, Jack was just another friendly neighbor, but there were hints, small, easily overlooked clues that suggested he wasn't as ordinary as he seemed. For instance, there was the time he helped old Mrs. Carter fix her fence. The wood was splintered and falling apart, and everyone assumed it would take days to repair. But Jack showed up one morning with a toolbox and a quiet determination. By lunchtime, the fence was as good as new. "You work fast," Mrs. Carter had said, impressed. Jack just smiled and replied, "You pick up a thing or two over the years." Or the time a stray dog had wandered into the neighborhood, barking and growling at anyone who got too close. The animal was clearly scared and aggressive, but Jack had walked right up to it, kneeling down and speaking in a low, soothing voice. Within minutes, the dog was wagging its tail, letting Jack lead it away on a makeshift leash. "How'd you do that?" someone had asked. Jack shrugged. "Sometimes, it's just about staying calm." Incidents like these added to the quiet mystery surrounding Jack Mercer. But no one pressed him for details. If he wanted to share, he would. In the meantime, the people of Brookhaven were content to have him around. He was a good neighbor, the kind you were happy to see at events like today's barbecue. Jack had arrived early that morning, helping set up tables and chairs before most of the town even showed up. Now, as the festivities were in full swing, he sat at his small grill, tending to a batch of hot dogs and hamburgers. Every now and then, someone would stop by to chat or grab a plate of food, and Jack would greet them with a friendly nod and a few words. But mostly, he kept to himself, content to watch the cheerful chaos unfold around him. As the hours passed, the park grew livelier. Kids squealed with delight as they played tag near the playground. A group of teenagers tossed a frisbee back and forth, their laughter ringing out every time someone missed a catch. Adults mingled around the picnic tables, exchanging recipes and gossip. The local band set up near the gazebo, tuning their instruments for an afternoon performance. It was the kind of day that reminded everyone why they loved living in Brookhaven. Jack smiled faintly as he watched a young boy struggle to carry a plate piled high with food. The boy's mother rushed over, laughing as she steadied his wobbling load. Moments like these made Jack appreciate the simplicity of small-town life. After everything he'd been through, this was exactly what he needed, a place where the biggest concern was whether there'd be enough potato salad to go around. But as much as Jack enjoyed the peace and quiet of Brookhaven, he couldn't help but feel a certain restlessness from time to time. He had spent most of his life in a very different world, a world where peace was fragile and quiet moments were few and far between. Jack Mercer wasn't just a retired Marine, he was a man who had seen and done things most people couldn't imagine. He had fought in wars, led missions, and faced dangers that left scars both visible and hidden. His body had healed, but his mind carried the weight of memories he rarely let surface. Jack had come to Brookhaven to escape that life, to leave behind the battles and the losses. For the most part, he had succeeded. He spent his days gardening, fixing up his house, and helping his neighbors when they needed it. But there were times late at night, when the world was still, when the memories crept back in. He'd sit on his porch, staring out at the dark horizon, and remind himself that those days were over. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just Jack Mercer, the quiet widower with a knack for fixing fences and calming stray dogs. Or at least, that's what he told himself. As the afternoon wore on, Jack continued grilling, occasionally glancing around the park. It was a habit he couldn't shake, the need to stay aware of his surroundings. Most people wouldn't have noticed the small details Jack picked up on: the man near the gazebo checking his watch repeatedly, the group of teenagers who seemed more interested in scanning the crowd than playing frisbee, the couple arguing quietly by the parking lot. None of it seemed out of place to anyone else, but Jack's instincts told him to pay attention. Still, he pushed the thoughts aside. This was Brookhaven. Nothing ever happened here. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. But then they showed up. It started with a low, distant rumble, so faint at first that it blended into the background noise of the barbecue. But as the sound grew louder, heads began to turn. The rumble became a roar, unmistakable now, the sound of motorcycles. Several of them. Jack set down his tongs, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked toward the park entrance. A line of bikes came into view, their riders clad in leather jackets and dark sunglasses. They moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, their engines revving as they pulled into the parking lot. The laughter and chatter of the barbecue quieted, replaced by an uneasy murmur. Parents pulled their children closer. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances. The bikers parked their motorcycles and dismounted, their presence commanding attention without a word. Jack watched them silently, his calm demeanor unchanged. But inside, something shifted. He didn't know who they were or why they were here. But he had a feeling this day was about to take a very different turn. The bikers walked into the park as if they owned the place. There were 6 of them in total, each one exuding a rough, intimidating aura. Their leather jackets were adorned with patches, skulls, flames, and the name of their gang, the Iron Fangs. The leader was easy to spot. He was taller than the others, broad-shouldered, with a beard that framed his scowling face. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but the way he carried himself made it clear he was used to people getting out of his way. The others weren't much friendlier. One had a chain dangling from his belt that clinked with every step. Another was chewing gum loudly, smirking at the startled expressions of the barbecue goers. A third was covered in tattoos, his arms crossed as he scanned the crowd like he was looking for trouble. The leader stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He stopped near the picnic tables, taking in the scene with an air of amusement. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Looks like we found ourselves a little party." No one responded. The cheerful atmosphere of the barbecue had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence. The families who had been laughing and chatting only moments ago now stood frozen, unsure of what to do. A few of the kids clung to their parents, sensing the tension in the air. Jack watched it all unfold from his spot by the grill. He didn't move, didn't say a word. But his sharp eyes were fixed on the bikers, taking in every detail: the way they spread out, the way their leader's hand rested casually on his belt, just inches away from a large hunting knife. The leader smirked at the silence. "What's the matter?" he said, spreading his arms wide. "Don't tell me we're not welcome." A brave soul stepped forward: Tom Henderson, one of the barbecue's organizers. Tom was a big guy, the kind of man who looked like he could hold his own in a fight. But even he seemed nervous as he approached the leader. "This is a community event," Tom said, his voice steady but cautious. "We're just here to enjoy the day. If you're looking for food, you're welcome to grab a plate and join us. But let's keep things peaceful, all right?" The leader tilted his head, as if considering the offer. Then he chuckled. "Peaceful, huh? Sure, we can do peaceful." He walked over to one of the tables, picked up a plate of ribs, and took a big bite, chewing slowly as he stared Tom down. "Nice ribs," he said, his tone mocking. "You make these?" Tom hesitated. "No, those were made by Mrs. Carter over there," he said, nodding toward an elderly woman standing a few feet away. The leader turned his gaze to Mrs. Carter, who shrank back under his stare. "Well, Mrs. Carter," he said, smirking, "you've got a real talent. Maybe you can make us some more, huh? My boys are hungry." Mrs. Carter didn't respond, clutching her purse tightly as if it might shield her from the man's presence. Jack's eyes flicked toward Mrs. Carter, then back to the bikers. He could feel the unease rippling through the crowd, the way people were starting to back away, hoping to avoid drawing attention to themselves. But Jack didn't move. He stayed by his grill, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. The leader must have noticed Jack, because he turned his attention toward him. "What about you, old-timer?" he called out. "You got any food for us?" Jack looked up, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. "There's plenty of food on the tables," he said evenly. "Help yourself." The leader raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by Jack's calmness. He walked over to Jack's grill, peering at the burgers and hot dogs sizzling on the grate. "Smells good," he said. "You cook these yourself?" "Yep," Jack replied. The leader picked up a burger patty with his bare hands, ignoring the spatula sitting nearby. He took a bite, chewing loudly. "Not bad," he said, though his tone was dismissive. He dropped the half-eaten patty back onto the grill, where it landed with a hiss. Jack didn't react. He simply flipped another burger, his movements steady and precise. The leader frowned, clearly expecting more of a response. "You're awful quiet, Grandpa," he said. "Don't you got anything to say?" Jack glanced up at him, his steel gray eyes steady. "I don't like wasting words," he said simply. The leader stared at him for a moment, then let out a bark of laughter. "Wasting words, huh? That's a good one. You hear that, boys? Grandpa here thinks he's a philosopher." The other bikers chuckled, though their laughter felt forced, like they were trying too hard to back up their leader. Jack didn't respond. He turned his attention back to the grill, flipping a hot dog with practiced ease. But his mind was already working, analyzing the situation. These men weren't here by accident. They weren't just passing through, looking for a meal. They had come here with a purpose. Jack didn't know what that purpose was yet, but he had a feeling it wasn't good. The leader seemed to lose interest in Jack, turning back to the rest of the barbecue. He clapped his hands together, grinning. "All right, folks," he said loudly. "Let's make this a day to remember. My boys and I are gonna join the party. Hope you don't mind." No one dared to protest. The bikers spread out, helping themselves to food and drinks, their presence casting a shadow over the once cheerful gathering. Parents kept their children close, whispering quietly to each other. The local band, who had been setting up their instruments, hesitated, unsure whether to continue. Jack kept an eye on the bikers as they moved through the crowd, their behavior becoming bolder by the minute. One of them knocked over a cooler, spilling ice and soda cans onto the grass. Another grabbed a plate of cookies and started eating them one by one, tossing the crumbs onto the ground. The leader, meanwhile, made his way over to a group of young women standing near one of the picnic tables. He leaned in close, his smile predatory. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked one of them, ignoring the way she tried to step away. Jack felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest. He had seen men like this before, men who thrived on intimidation, who enjoyed making others feel small and powerless. But he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't his fight. Not yet. Instead, he watched. Jack's training as a Marine had taught him many things, but one of the most important lessons was patience. You didn't rush into a situation without understanding it first. You observed, you gathered information, and you waited for the right moment to act. And so Jack waited. From his spot by the grill, he noted everything: the way the leader carried himself, the way the other bikers followed his lead, the weapons they carried. He saw the hunting knife on the leader's belt, the chain on the other man's waist, the bulge under one jacket that might have been a concealed gun. He also saw the fear in the eyes of the people around him, the way they avoided the biker's gaze, hoping to go unnoticed. Jack had left his old life behind for a reason. He had promised himself he was done with violence, done with conflict. He just wanted to live a quiet life, far away from the chaos and danger he had once known. But as he watched the bikers continue to push the boundaries, testing how far they could go, Jack felt something stir deep within him. A part of him he had tried to bury. A part of him that was very, very good at dealing with men like these. The roar of engines had already disrupted the barbecue, but the bikers' arrival was a storm all its own. 6 of them strolled into the park as if they owned it, their boots crunching over the gravel path. They moved with swagger, a mix of arrogance and aggression, as though daring anyone to challenge them. Their leather jackets bore a name that seemed to hang in the air like a threat: the Iron Fangs. Brick, the gang's leader, was a hulking figure. His arms were thick with muscle, tattoos snaking across his skin like battle scars. A knife hung from his belt, its handle worn from use. His beard, bushy and unkempt, only added to the wildness in his appearance. As he strode into the crowd, the world seemed to shrink under his imposing frame. He didn't need to speak right away; his mere presence was enough to silence the murmur of uneasy conversations. "Nice little party you've got here," Brick finally said, his voice loud and rough. The edges of his words were jagged, like a man who was used to barking orders and having them obeyed. He leaned over the nearest table, grabbed a plate of ribs, and started eating without asking. His chewing was loud, purposeful, like he wanted everyone to hear it. Behind him, his gang spread out, each member a shadow of menace. One flipped over a cooler just to see the drinks spill out, snickering as cans rolled across the grass. Another leaned against a tree, chewing gum loudly and scanning the crowd with a smirk that dared anyone to object. A third fiddled with a chain hanging from his belt, spinning it idly like a predator flexing its claws. The families who had been laughing and enjoying the sunny afternoon were now frozen in place. Parents clutched their children tightly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the local band, halfway through setting up their instruments, paused awkwardly, unsure whether to continue or pack up and leave. The host, Tom Henderson, stepped forward hesitantly. He was a big man, but his confidence wavered as he faced Brick. "We're just, here for a community lunch," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. "No trouble, all right." Brick smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile; it was the kind of grin that made your stomach turn. "Oh, there won't be any trouble," he said slowly, savoring each word. "As long as you all play nice." His gaze drifted over the crowd, his dark eyes sharp and calculating, as if he were sizing up everyone in the park. And then his gaze landed on Jack Mercer. Jack hadn't moved from his spot by the grill. He sat there, calm and composed, as though the gang's arrival hadn't changed a thing. In one hand, he held a glass of lemonade, which he sipped with the kind of patience most people only dreamed of. His eyes, however, told a different story. Steel gray and unblinking, they were fixed on Brick, studying him like a hawk sizing up its prey. Brick noticed Jack's lack of reaction, and his grin faded slightly. Something about the older man's quiet stillness rubbed him the wrong way. Most people looked away when Brick stared at them, but Jack didn't flinch. "What about you, Grandpa?" Brick said, taking a step closer to Jack. His voice was loud enough to draw attention, and now all eyes in the park were on the two men. "You got a problem?" Jack looked up slowly, meeting Brick's gaze without hesitation. His expression was calm, his voice even. "No problem," he said simply. But there was something about the way Jack said it, something unshakable, unmovable, that made Brick pause. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance, either. It was something far more unsettling. Brick leaned down, looming over Jack like a bear trying to intimidate a smaller animal. "You sure about that?" he growled. Jack didn't blink. "I'm sure," he replied. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The crowd watched, too afraid to speak. Even Brick's gang seemed uncertain, shifting uneasily as they waited to see what their leader would do. Finally, Brick straightened up, letting out a bark of laughter. "All right, Grandpa," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Enjoy your lemonade." He turned back to his gang, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. If anything, it thickened. The bikers continued their slow invasion of the barbecue, helping themselves to food and drinks, making a mess of everything they touched. One of them grabbed a watermelon from a table and smashed it on the ground, laughing as the pink flesh splattered everywhere. Another started going through the coolers, tossing aside bottles of soda as if they were garbage. The families huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. A few parents quietly led their children toward the parking lot, hoping to leave unnoticed. But for most, leaving didn't feel like an option. The bikers had positioned themselves strategically, blocking the main paths out of the park. It was clear they wanted an audience. Brick made his way to a group of young women standing near the picnic tables. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked one of them, his voice low and oily. The young woman, clearly uncomfortable, tried to step back, but Brick followed her. "Don't be shy," he said, his grin widening. "We're just having a little fun." Jack saw it all. From his spot by the grill, he noticed the way the young woman's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. He noticed the way the other women tried to shield her without drawing too much attention to themselves. And he noticed the way Brick leaned in closer, his smile no longer playful but predatory. Jack's grip on his lemonade tightened slightly. "Hey," Tom Henderson said, stepping forward again. "I don't think she's interested." His voice was firmer this time, but there was a nervous edge to it. Brick turned to Tom, his smile vanishing. "You don't think," he said, his tone icy. "Well, maybe you should stop thinking and mind your own business." Tom didn't back down. "This is a family event," he said. "If you can't respect that, then maybe it's time for you to leave." Brick's jaw tightened, and the park fell silent once again. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually leave. But then he laughed a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. "Leave?" Brick said, his voice full of mock disbelief. "We just got here. Besides," he gestured to the food, the drinks, the terrified faces around him. "We're having too much fun." The gang laughed with him, their laughter echoing through the park like a cruel joke. Jack set his glass down on the edge of the grill. Slowly, he stood up, brushing his hands against his jeans. He didn't say anything, didn't make a move toward Brick or his gang. But the simple act of standing seemed to change the air around him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the people closest to Jack felt it, the shift in his posture, the way he held himself. He wasn't just an old man standing by a grill anymore. He was something else. Brick noticed it too, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He glanced at Jack, frowning slightly, before turning back to Tom. "You got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." One of the bikers, the one with the chain, stepped closer to Tom, swinging the chain lazily in one hand. "You heard the boss," he said, his voice full of menace. "Maybe it's time for you to sit down." Tom hesitated, glancing around for support. His eyes landed on Jack, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Tom took a deep breath and stood his ground. "I'm not sitting down," he said. The biker with the chain stopped swinging it, his smirk fading. For a moment, the park was deathly quiet. And then, with a flick of his wrist, the biker lashed out. The chain flew through the air, aimed straight for Tom. But before it could connect, something happened. Something fast. Jack moved. The chain snapped through the air, gleaming in the sunlight, but it never reached its target. Jack's hand shot out like lightning, catching the chain mid-swing. The sudden halt of movement sent a sharp metallic clang echoing across the park. For a moment, everyone froze. The biker holding the chain stared at Jack in disbelief, his grip faltering slightly. Jack held the chain firmly, his expression calm but unyielding, his steel-gray eyes locking onto the biker's with a weight that made the younger man hesitate. "You don't want to do this," Jack said, his voice low and steady, carrying the kind of authority that demanded attention. The biker's shock quickly morphed into anger. He yanked the chain, trying to free it from Jack's grip, but Jack didn't budge. If anything, his hold tightened, the muscles in his weathered arm flexing just enough to show he wasn't as frail as he might have looked. "Let go, old man," the biker spat, his voice rising. Jack tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Not until you back off." The biker's frustration boiled over, and he lunged forward, his free hand swinging in a clumsy punch. It was a mistake. Jack moved with precision, his body shifting just enough to avoid the punch. In the same motion, he gave the chain a sharp pull, yanking the biker off balance. The younger man stumbled, his feet slipping on the grass, and Jack released the chain, letting him fall to the ground with a thud. The crowd gasped. For the first time since the bikers arrived, the spell of fear that had gripped everyone seemed to break. Brick's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow over Jack. Well, he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Looks like Grandpa's got some fight in him." Jack turned to face Brick, his posture relaxed but alert. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Take your boys and leave." Brick chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "You don't want trouble," he repeated, mockingly. "You just dropped one of my guys in front of everyone, and now you're telling me to leave." Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Despite the height and size difference, there was something about Jack's presence that made him seem just as imposing as the gang leader. "Yes," Jack said finally, his voice steady. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Brick's grin faltered, replaced by a scowl. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone who looked like they should be at home watching TV. He glanced at his gang, who were watching the exchange with a mix of confusion and irritation. "All right, tough guy," Brick said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see if you're as tough as you think." Before anyone could react, Brick lunged at Jack, his fists swinging with brute force. But Jack was ready. He sidestepped the first punch effortlessly, his movements smooth and controlled. Brick swung again, but Jack ducked, his reflexes sharp and practiced. To the crowd, it looked like a dance, one man using sheer aggression and power, the other moving with precision and experience. Jack didn't counter right away. He was measuring Brick, reading his movements, waiting for the right moment. And when it came, it was quick. Brick threw a wide, heavy punch, leaving his side open. Jack stepped in, his hand shooting up to grab Brick's wrist. In one fluid motion, he twisted, using Brick's own momentum against him. The gang leader let out a grunt of pain as Jack forced him off balance, pushing him back a few steps. The crowd watched in stunned silence. They had expected the old man to get flattened, but here he was, standing his ground against a man twice his size. Brick's face turned red with anger. "You're gonna regret that," he growled, his voice thick with rage. The rest of the gang began to close in, sensing that their leader was losing control of the situation. The biker with the chain picked himself up, rubbing his bruised shoulder, and reached for a knife strapped to his belt. Another gang member pulled out a steel pipe, twirling it menacingly as they surrounded Jack. Jack's eyes flicked between them, his mind working quickly. He wasn't cornered yet, but the odds were shifting. He could feel the weight of the crowd's fear pressing down on him, families, kids, and neighbors who had no idea what to do. "Stay back," someone from the crowd yelled, their voice shaking. Brick laughed, a cruel sound that cut through the tension. "No one's gonna save you now, Grandpa," he said. "Let's see how tough you really are." Jack didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back, positioning himself near the grill. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but his posture was anything but relaxed. He was ready. The first biker came at him, swinging the steel pipe with reckless abandon. Jack moved quickly, stepping inside the swing and grabbing the man's wrist. With a sharp twist, he disarmed the biker, the pipe clattering to the ground. Jack followed up with a precise elbow to the man's chest, sending him stumbling backward, gasping for air. Another biker rushed in, his knife flashing in the sunlight. Jack dodged the blade, using the edge of the grill to deflect the attack. In one swift motion, he grabbed a pair of tongs from the grill and jabbed them at the biker's wrist. The man yelped in pain, dropping the knife. Brick watched, his fists clenched, as one by one, his gang members were taken down. Jack moved with a practiced efficiency, each action calculated, each strike purposeful. He wasn't fighting like a man defending himself, he was fighting like someone who had been here before. Finally, it was just Brick and Jack again. The gang leader stared at the older man, his chest heaving with anger and frustration. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Jack didn't answer right away. He adjusted his stance, his eyes locked on Brick. "Just someone who's had enough of bullies," he said. Brick roared in anger, charging at Jack with everything he had. This time, Jack didn't dodge. He stood his ground, meeting Brick's attack head-on. The impact was fierce, the two men grappling for control. Brick was strong, but Jack's movements were precise, his strength tempered by experience. He shifted his weight, using Brick's momentum to throw him off balance. With a final, powerful shove, Jack sent the gang leader sprawling to the ground. Brick lay there for a moment, stunned. The crowd erupted into cheers, their fear replaced by relief and admiration. Jack took a step back, breathing steadily as he surveyed the scene. The gang was defeated, their leader humiliated. "This is over," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "Take your boys and leave." Brick pushed himself up, glaring at Jack. But he didn't argue. With a grunt, he signaled to his gang, who reluctantly began to gather their things. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles and roared away, the crowd began to applaud, their cheers growing louder with each passing moment. Jack turned back to the grill, picking up his glass of lemonade. He took a sip, his expression as calm as it had been when the day began. "Who is that guy?" someone whispered. Tom Henderson stepped forward, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "You've got some explaining to do, Jack," he said, grinning. Jack just smiled faintly. "Maybe another time," he said. The day wasn't over yet, but one thing was clear: Jack Mercer was no ordinary man. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like the Marine in him wasn't as far behind as he'd hoped. As Jack approached the grill, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. The bikers snickered among themselves, their laughter sharp and grating, while the rest of the barbecue guests remained frozen in uneasy silence. Parents clung to their children, and friends exchanged anxious glances. No one dared to step forward, fearing they'd be the next target of the gang's cruel antics. Jack moved with the same deliberate calm he'd shown since the bikers arrived. He flipped a few patties on the grill, his back to the chaos. To the untrained eye, he seemed indifferent, like he was simply following orders. But to anyone paying attention, there was something calculated about his movements. He wasn't just cooking, he was thinking. Planning. Behind him, the gang grew louder. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, grabbed a bottle of ketchup and sprayed it across a nearby tablecloth, cackling like a hyena. Another kicked over a stack of chairs, sending them clattering to the ground. Brick leaned against a table, watching his crew with an approving smirk. "Let's see how long it takes for someone to grow a backbone," Brick muttered to no one in particular, his voice dripping with mockery. Jack turned slightly, just enough to glance over his shoulder. His sharp gray eyes took in every detail: the way Brick's fingers drummed lazily on his belt, the bulge under his leather jacket that likely concealed a weapon, the way the other bikers looked to him for cues. Brick was the leader, and like all bullies, he thrived on fear and attention. "Coming right up," Jack said, his voice calm as he plated a fresh batch of burgers. He carried the platter toward the group, setting it down on the nearest table with steady hands. One of the bikers, a muscular brute with tattoos snaking up his neck, reached for a burger. But before he could take a bite, Jack spoke. "You might want to let it cool first," Jack said, his tone casual but firm. The biker froze mid-motion, confused by the comment. Brick raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "And why's that, Grandpa?" Brick asked, leaning forward with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Jack's gaze flickered to the grill for just a moment. "Hot grease. Burns quick," he replied simply. The biker holding the burger hesitated, then scoffed and shoved the food into his mouth anyway. Jack said nothing, but the corners of his lips twitched ever so slightly, a fleeting expression that Brick noticed, though he couldn't quite place why it unsettled him. "You got something to say?" Brick pressed, his smirk faltering. Jack met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Not yet." The subtle challenge in Jack's words hung in the air, sparking a ripple of unease among the gang. Brick straightened, clearly irritated by the lack of fear in Jack's tone. "Careful, old man," Brick warned, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You're starting to sound like you've got a death wish." Jack didn't flinch. He didn't need to. Years of experience had taught him that the loudest man in the room was often the weakest. And Brick, for all his bravado, was no exception. Meanwhile, the barbecue guests watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Most of them still felt the sharp edge of fear, but a few began to notice what Brick hadn't: Jack wasn't afraid. He wasn't nervous, or flustered, or scrambling to appease the bikers like everyone else. He was calm, too calm. "Hey, boss," the scarred biker said suddenly, pointing to a nearby cooler. "Looks like they've got beers stashed in there." Brick's eyes lit up with interest. He strode toward the cooler, shoving aside a teenage boy who had been sitting nearby. The boy's father started to protest, but a glare from one of the other bikers silenced him. Brick flipped open the cooler lid, his grin widening at the sight of the neatly packed cans. "Now this," he said, grabbing a beer and popping the tab, "is what I call hospitality." He took a long swig, then looked back at Jack. "You should join us, Grandpa," he said mockingly, raising his can in a mock toast. "Might loosen you up a bit." Jack didn't respond. He turned back to the grill, his movements unhurried. The bikers' laughter filled the air again, but it was starting to feel forced. Their leader might still be enjoying himself, but the others were growing uneasy. Something about Jack wasn't adding up. One of the younger bikers, a jittery man with a nervous energy, nudged the scarred one. "What's this guy's deal?" he muttered. "Why's he just standing there?" The scarred biker shrugged. "Who cares? He's just some old dude. Probably too scared to." "He's not scared," Brick interrupted, his voice cutting through the chatter. He was watching Jack closely now, his expression no longer amused. "Not even a little." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jack glanced over his shoulder, meeting Brick's gaze with a steady calm that only seemed to stoke the gang leader's irritation. "I think it's time we made things a little more interesting," Brick said, tossing his empty beer can to the ground. He motioned for the scarred biker to step forward. "You," he said, pointing at Jack. "Let's see how quick you really are. Catch." Before anyone could react, the scarred biker hurled the chain he'd been carrying straight at Jack. It was a deliberate move, fast enough to test him, but not so aggressive that it couldn't be passed off as a joke if things went sideways. The chain arced through the air, gleaming in the sunlight. Jack's hand shot up, catching it mid-flight with a sharp metallic clang. The sound echoed across the park, drawing gasps from the crowd. For a moment, everything stopped. Even the bikers seemed stunned, their smirks fading as they processed what they'd just seen. Jack held the chain loosely in his hand, the links clinking softly as he let them dangle. He turned it over once, inspecting it as if it were an ordinary object and not a weapon. Then he looked up, his expression calm but firm. "Is this yours?" he asked, his tone polite but unmistakably pointed. The scarred biker stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Brick stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "You've got some quick hands for an old man," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. Jack shrugged, tossing the chain to the ground at the scarred biker's feet. "Just lucky, I guess." But luck had nothing to do with it, and Brick knew it. The gang leader's eyes narrowed as he studied Jack more closely. There was something about the way the older man carried himself, something that didn't fit with the quiet, unassuming image he projected. Brick's grin returned, but it was smaller now, more calculated. "Well, Grandpa," he said, his voice dripping with fake camaraderie, "looks like you've got some tricks up your sleeve. But let's see how you do when the stakes are higher." Jack didn't respond, but his posture shifted slightly, his shoulders squaring as he prepared for whatever was coming next. The rising tension crackled like static in the air, leaving the crowd on edge. One thing was becoming increasingly clear: Jack Mercer wasn't just a retired widower. And whatever he was, the bikers were about to find out the hard way. The scarred biker bent down, retrieving the chain from the ground, his hands trembling slightly. He shot Brick a glance, seeking reassurance, but Brick waved him off dismissively, his grin returning in full force as he tried to regain control of the situation. "All right, old man," Brick said, taking a step closer to Jack, his voice carrying a dangerous edge now. "You've had your fun, showing off for the kids. But here's the thing, you're on our time now. So why don't you sit down and let us run the show?" Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward just enough to close the gap between them, his towering presence suddenly far more imposing than anyone expected. For the first time, a few of the bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering. Brick noticed it too, and it only fueled his anger. The crowd remained silent, watching as this unassuming man stood toe-to-toe with a gang that had been terrorizing the park all afternoon. It was a standoff, the kind that made time seem to stretch indefinitely. "I am sitting down," Jack finally replied, his voice low and steady. "But not because you told me to." The subtle defiance in his words was like a spark to dry tinder. Brick's grin dropped entirely, replaced by a sneer. He turned to his crew, barking orders to ramp up the intimidation. "Break it all down," he shouted. "These folks need to learn how to share." The bikers sprang into action, kicking over tables, smashing plates, and tearing into anything they could get their hands on. The guests cried out in alarm, retreating as far back as they could while still clutching onto their children and belongings. Jack didn't move, his eyes narrowing as he watched the destruction unfold. His hands, once relaxed at his sides, now clenched into fists, the veins along his forearms visible under his tanned skin. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The single word was delivered with such authority that even the bikers paused, glancing toward Brick for guidance. Brick's lips twisted into a snarl. He wasn't about to let some grandpa dictate how things were going to go. "You don't get to say when it's enough," Brick growled, stepping forward again. He jabbed a finger into Jack's chest, trying to provoke him. "You're not in charge here." "I am." Jack's hand moved so quickly that no one saw it coming. In a split second, he caught Brick's wrist mid-jab, holding it firmly in place. Brick's bravado faltered as he realized he couldn't pull away. "Let go," Brick hissed, struggling against Jack's iron grip. Jack leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low growl that only Brick could hear. "You've already crossed too many lines today. You might want to rethink the next one." Brick yanked his arm free with a growl, but the damage was done. The shift in power was undeniable, and even Brick's crew could feel it. They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to proceed. "Fine," Brick spat, rubbing his wrist. "You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you really are." He nodded toward one of his men, a burly, tattooed biker who looked like he could bench press a truck. The man cracked his knuckles and stepped forward, looming over Jack. "Think you can handle me, old man?" the biker taunted, circling Jack like a predator sizing up its prey. Jack didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, his sharp eyes tracking the biker's movements with an unnerving calm. The biker lunged suddenly, aiming to shove Jack back, but Jack sidestepped effortlessly, the move so smooth it was almost as if he'd anticipated it. The biker stumbled slightly, turning back with a snarl. "What's the matter?" Jack asked, his voice calm but cutting. "Missed your target." The taunt infuriated the biker, who charged again, this time swinging a meaty fist. Jack ducked under the blow, his movements precise and measured, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. The crowd gasped as Jack twisted around, grabbing the biker's arm and using his momentum against him. In one fluid motion, Jack flipped the man over his shoulder, sending him crashing onto the ground with a thud that seemed to shake the earth. The biker groaned, dazed and clutching his back as he struggled to get up. Jack stood over him, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. "You picked the wrong fight," Jack said evenly. The rest of the bikers froze, their confidence shattered by the sight of their strongest member taken down so effortlessly. Brick, however, refused to back down. His face twisted in rage as he pulled a knife from his belt, brandishing it with a flourish. "All right, Grandpa," Brick snarled, his voice shaking with anger. "Let's see how you do against this." Jack's eyes flickered to the blade, then back to Brick's face. He didn't seem intimidated, if anything, he looked bored. "You really don't want to do this," Jack warned, his voice calm but laced with steel. Brick laughed, though it was a hollow sound. "Oh, I think I do." He lunged at Jack, the blade flashing in the sunlight. The crowd screamed, but Jack remained perfectly calm. At the last possible second, he shifted his weight, dodging the attack and grabbing Brick's wrist in one swift motion. With a practiced twist, Jack disarmed Brick, sending the knife clattering to the ground. Before Brick could react, Jack delivered a quick, controlled strike to his chest, sending him staggering backward. Brick gasped for air, his hand clutching at his chest as he stumbled to his knees. The other bikers didn't dare move, their earlier bravado replaced by outright fear. Jack picked up the knife, inspecting it briefly before tossing it far out of reach. He looked down at Brick, his expression unreadable. "You should have stayed home," Jack said simply. Brick glared up at him, his face red with humiliation. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. Jack leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "No. You don't know who you're messing with." The silence that followed was deafening. Brick's crew exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure of whether to intervene or cut their losses and leave. "You heard him," Jack said, his voice carrying across the park. "It's time to go." The authority in his tone was impossible to ignore. One by one, the bikers began to back away, their earlier bravado reduced to sheepish obedience. Even Brick, still fuming, didn't dare challenge Jack further. As the gang retreated to their motorcycles, the tension in the air began to lift. The barbecue guests watched in stunned silence as the bikers roared off, their engines fading into the distance. Jack turned back to the crowd, his calm demeanor returning as if nothing had happened. He picked up his drink from the table and took a sip, his sharp eyes scanning the group. "You okay?" he asked a young boy who had been clutching his mother's leg in fear. The boy nodded slowly, his wide eyes filled with awe. Jack offered him a small smile before turning back to the grill. The crowd began to murmur, the fear giving way to relief and admiration. They didn't know much about Jack Mercer, but one thing was clear, he wasn't just some ordinary retiree. He was someone you didn't mess with. Brick's breathing was ragged, his cocky grin long gone as he knelt on the grass, cradling his twisted arm. The quiet in the park was deafening now. The kids who had been playing earlier were clutching their parents, the barbecue guests frozen in place, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The other bikers lay scattered like discarded chess pieces, groaning or glaring up at Jack with a mix of fear and anger. One had tried to come at him with a chain. Jack had turned the weapon against him in a heartbeat. Another had rushed with brute force, only to find himself flat on his back from a quick throw Jack executed as though it was second nature. Jack stood in the middle of the chaos he'd just created, his breathing steady, his stance relaxed. He could have been mistaken for just another guy at the barbecue, but his movements had told a different story. He wasn't just a retiree, he was a force of nature. Brick, still cradling his arm, forced himself to his feet. "You've made a big mistake, old man," he spat, though his voice trembled. "You don't know who we are. You don't know who I am." Jack tilted his head slightly, his calm, calculating gaze fixed on Brick. "I don't need to know who you are," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I already know what you are, bullies. And I've dealt with your kind before." Brick's sneer faltered as Jack took a slow step forward. Jack didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone made everyone lean in closer. "You roll into places like this, thinking you can take what you want. Thinking no one's going to stand up to you. But today, you picked the wrong man." Brick's bluster faltered entirely now. What are you?" he stammered, his voice breaking. Jack stepped closer, just enough so Brick could see the intensity in his eyes. "I'm retired," he said simply, the weight of that word landing like a hammer. For a moment, Brick didn't seem to understand. But then, realization began to dawn in his eyes. The precision of Jack's movements, the calm under pressure, the way he seemed to anticipate their every move, it wasn't by chance. Brick's jaw tightened as he pieced it together. "You're military," Brick said, almost choking on the words. Jack didn't deny it. He merely nodded slightly, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Something like that," he said, his tone so understated it was chilling. One of the bikers groaned from the ground, trying to prop himself up. "What's he talking about, Brick? What's going on?" Brick ignored him, his eyes locked on Jack. "You think this is over," he said, his bravado returning, though it sounded hollow now. "We've got numbers, connections. You think you can take us all down?" Jack didn't flinch. "I don't think. I know." Brick's face darkened, his anger overtaking his caution. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a second knife. The crowd gasped, some parents shielding their children. "Enough," a voice cried out. It was the barbecue host, his face pale as he stepped forward, trembling. "Please, just go. We don't want any more trouble." Brick ignored him, his focus entirely on Jack. "You're dead," he hissed, lunging forward with the knife. But Jack was faster. Much faster. In one swift motion, Jack sidestepped the attack, grabbed Brick's wrist, and twisted it with expert precision. The knife fell from Brick's hand, and Jack caught it mid-air, spinning it around in his grip before holding it against Brick's throat. The crowd gasped. Even the bikers froze, their defiance replaced by raw fear. Brick's breath hitched as he realized just how close the blade was to his skin. Jack leaned in, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "I could end this right now," he said, his tone devoid of anger or malice. It was a simple statement of fact, which made it all the more terrifying. "But I won't. Because I'm giving you a chance to walk away and never come back." Brick swallowed hard, his bravado utterly shattered. "Why you wouldn't?" Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. "Try me." For a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. No one moved, no one breathed. Then, slowly, Jack released Brick, stepping back and tossing the knife to the ground at his feet. Brick stumbled, his hand flying to his neck as if to make sure he was still intact. "You have 5 seconds to leave," Jack said, his tone calm but final. Brick hesitated, looking around at his crew for support, but all he found were fearful stares. No one was willing to back him up now. "1, Jack began, his voice steady. Brick scrambled backward, almost tripping over his own feet as he made his way to his motorcycle. 2. The other bikers hurried to follow, limping and stumbling toward their bikes, their earlier swagger completely gone. 3. Engines roared to life as they fumbled to start their bikes, Brick leading the charge. 4. The sound of tires screeching on asphalt filled the air as the gang sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Jack watched them go, his expression unreadable. Only when the sound of the engines faded into the distance did he finally turn back to the crowd. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a slow ripple of applause began, hesitant at first but growing louder as people processed what had just happened. Jack held up a hand, stopping the applause. "Let's not make a big deal out of it," he said, his voice calm. "I just wanted to enjoy my barbecue." The crowd chuckled nervously, the tension slowly giving way to relief. The barbecue host approached Jack, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Mercer. I don't know how to thank you. That was incredible." Jack shook his head. "No need to thank me," he said. "Just make sure everyone's okay." As the crowd began to regroup, Jack returned to his seat by the grill, picking up his drink and taking a long sip. The kids stared at him in awe, the adults whispering to each other as they tried to piece together who this quiet, unassuming man really was. One young man, clearly braver than the others, stepped forward. "You're not just retired, are you?" he asked. Jack looked up at him, a faint smile playing on his lips. I am, he said simply. But some things, you don't retire from. And with that, he turned back to the grill, flipping a few burgers as though nothing had happened. But everyone there knew better. Jack Mercer wasn't just a neighbor. He was something else entirely, something extraordinary. Brick and his gang may have roared away, but their dust hadn't fully settled before the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. The barbecue guests started to move again, cautiously stepping out from behind tables and picnic benches where they had sought cover. Whispers rippled through the crowd, speculative and awestruck. Did you see that? He took down all of them without breaking a sweat. How old is that guy? He's faster than anyone I've ever seen. Who is Jack Mercer? Jack, meanwhile, was back at the grill as though nothing had happened. The spatula in his hand flipped a burger with precise, practiced ease. His face betrayed no emotion. If anything, he seemed mildly inconvenienced, as though dealing with a gang of bikers was no different than swatting a persistent mosquito. The barbecue host, an older man named Gary, hesitated before approaching him again. His hands were still trembling, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from adrenaline and gratitude. Mr. Mercer, Gary started, his voice soft but filled with reverence, I think I speak for everyone here when I say, thank you. You saved us. Jack glanced at him, offering a small, polite nod. Did what needed to be done, he said simply, his tone so casual it felt almost surreal. Gary blinked, unsure how to respond. That wasn't just normal bravery. That was, he trailed off, searching for the right words. Efficient, Jack supplied, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Gary chuckled nervously, though he still looked as if he had more questions than answers. If you don't mind me asking, Jack, what did you mean earlier when you said you were retired? Retired from what, exactly? Jack paused, his gaze focused on the grill. For a moment, it seemed as though he might ignore the question entirely. Then he spoke, his voice quieter but firm. Let's just say I spent a lot of years cleaning up messes like this one. Gary frowned, curiosity burning in his eyes, but before he could press further, a young boy darted up to Jack. Mr. Mercer, the boy exclaimed, his face glowing with admiration. That was the coolest thing I've ever seen. Are you like a superhero or something? Jack finally smiled, his tough exterior softening slightly. Nah, kid, he said. I'm just an old man who knows a thing or two about handling troublemakers. But you're not just an old man, the boy insisted, his enthusiasm undeterred. You were like pow, and then wham, and they were all on the ground. He mimicked the moves, throwing imaginary punches and kicks. Jack chuckled, the sound deep and warm. Well, I guess you could say I've had a lot of practice. The boy's mother quickly approached, apologizing profusely for her son's interruptions. Jack waved it off with a good-natured shrug. It's fine, he said. Kids should ask questions. That's how they learn. As the mother led her son away, Jack returned his attention to the grill. But the questions weren't over. While the burgers sizzled, a small group of adults gathered at a nearby table, clearly deliberating. The confrontation with the bikers had shaken them, but more than that, it had opened their eyes to something extraordinary. Jack wasn't just the quiet neighbor they had underestimated. He was something else entirely. Finally, one of them, a woman named Clara, stood and approached Jack. She was one of the more outspoken residents and had a knack for cutting to the chase. Jack, Clara said, her tone both grateful and curious, we owe you for what you did today. But I think we all deserve to know, who are you, really? Jack sighed, setting down the spatula. He rubbed the back of his neck, as though weighing his words carefully. I'm a guy who's just trying to live a quiet life, he said, his voice steady but nonchalant. Clara wasn't satisfied with the vague answer. Come on, Jack. You don't take down a gang of bikers like that unless you've been trained. And not just any training, serious training. What's your story? Jack leaned against the grill, crossing his arms. He studied the group that had now gathered around him: Gary, Clara, and several other neighbors who looked both amazed and apprehensive. You really want to know? He asked, his tone making it clear they might not like what they heard. They nodded in unison. Jack exhaled deeply. All right, he said. I was in the Marines. Spent 25 years in service. After that, I worked a few specialized jobs. Things most people don't want to talk about. Specialized? Clara asked, her brow furrowing. You mean, black ops? Jack's silence was answer enough. The group exchanged stunned glances. Gary, who had been the most timid earlier, found his voice again. So, you were, like a spy? An assassin? Let's just say I've been in a lot of situations where quick thinking and quicker reflexes were the difference between life and death, Jack replied. The gravity of his words settled over them. For years, they had seen Jack as just another neighbor, quiet, polite, maybe a little reserved. But now they realized that beneath that unassuming exterior was a man who had faced unimaginable challenges and survived. Why here? Clara asked softly. Why would someone like you move to a quiet little town like ours? Jack's expression softened. Because I wanted peace, he said simply. After a lifetime of chaos, I wanted something different. I wanted to be surrounded by good people, live a simple life, and forget about the things I've done. His words hung in the air, a quiet honesty that touched everyone who heard them. As the barbecue guests began to relax, a young man approached Jack cautiously. He was one of the teenagers who had been helping set up earlier, and his face was pale with worry. Mr. Mercer, he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder, I heard Brick say something when they were leaving. He said they'd be back. Jack's jaw tightened slightly. He had heard it too, but he had hoped the others hadn't caught on. Don't worry about that, Jack said, his voice steady. If they come back, I'll handle it. But they could bring more guys. Guns, even, the teenager insisted. Jack placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. You let me worry about that, okay? Your job is to enjoy your summer and stay out of trouble. The boy nodded reluctantly, though the fear didn't fully leave his face. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the barbecue wound down, and people started to pack up. But the tension lingered. Everyone knew the bikers weren't the kind to let a humiliation like this slide. And everyone also knew that Jack Mercer was far more than he seemed. That night, as the neighborhood lights began to flicker off one by one, Jack sat on his porch, sipping a glass of water and staring into the distance. His calm demeanor never wavered, but his mind was already working, anticipating the next move. They would come back. He was certain of it. But this time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. Jack stood and stretched, his movements deliberate. He disappeared inside his house for a moment before returning with a small bag. He placed it on the porch and unzipped it, revealing a collection of tools and supplies that hadn't seen the light of day in years. It was time to prepare. Because if Brick and his crew thought today's encounter was the worst Jack could offer, they were sorely mistaken. As the sun rose the following morning, the quiet town began to stir, yet there was an air of unease that lingered, a tension that hadn't been there before. People went about their routines, but all around the neighborhood, there were hushed whispers and sideways glances. Everyone had witnessed something extraordinary the day before: a small group of bikers, causing havoc at the neighborhood barbecue, only to be quickly subdued by a quiet man they had underestimated. And now, that man was the talk of the town. Jack Mercer, the soft-spoken widower who had moved in just over a year ago, had become more than a mystery. He had become a legend. It wasn't long before the word spread. The bikers who had arrived with their leather jackets, roaring engines, and threatening grins had left with their tails between their legs. The police had arrived just in time to see the last of them stumbling away, bruised and defeated. Jack had given his statement, offering the kind of nonchalant simplicity that made it clear he wasn't someone who cared for recognition. Just did what needed doing, he had said. Nothing special. The officers had nodded, clearly understanding more than the average person could. They had known Jack's reputation long before yesterday. He wasn't just a retired Marine. He was a man with a past, a man who had likely seen more than most could ever imagine. One officer, a younger guy who had served with Jack years ago, tipped his hat and muttered, "Semper Fi, Mercer." Jack didn't respond with words. He only nodded an acknowledgement that didn't need to be verbalized. He had earned their respect long ago. With the bikers cuffed and escorted into squad cars, the park, once filled with chaos and tension, returned to a quieter state. The neighbors, who had been huddled together in fear, slowly began to emerge from their hiding places. Some approached Jack with gratitude, others with curiosity. Gary, the host of the barbecue, was the first to speak. He nervously shuffled his feet before offering Jack a nervous smile. "You know," he said, trying to break the tension with a joke, "next time, maybe you could just call the cops. No need to take on the whole gang yourself." Jack smirked, his eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something unreadable. "Next time, they won't get the chance," he said, his tone steady. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Gary's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, realizing that Jack wasn't joking. This man had a presence, something that couldn't be denied. It wasn't just strength. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had seen and survived things most people couldn't even imagine. The other neighbors, who had been standing nearby, exchanged glances. They weren't sure what to say. There was still so much they didn't understand about Jack, his past, the kind of person he had been, and the kind of person he was now. They knew he was capable of more than they could ever comprehend, but they also knew that they were lucky to have him as a neighbor. The day after the bikers were taken into custody, life in the neighborhood seemed to return to normal, but there was an undeniable change in the air. People were more aware of Jack, more respectful. They gave him space, but they also looked at him with new eyes, as if they had only just begun to see the man behind the quiet, unassuming exterior. At the local cafe, Clara, who had been one of the first to confront Jack the day before, found herself sitting with a cup of coffee, her thoughts drifting. She had been thinking about him for hours, wondering about the life he had led and the secrets he carried with him. She couldn't help but feel a little guilty for the way she had initially treated him, brushing him off as just another retiree with no real story. As she sipped her drink, she noticed Gary sitting at a table nearby, looking as though he was deep in thought. She waved him over, and he quickly joined her. "Clara," Gary said, his voice low. "I've been thinking about Jack." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What about him?" Gary lowered his voice even further, as if sharing something secretive. "You saw how he handled those bikers, right?" Clara nodded. "I saw. It was incredible. But what struck me was how he didn't even seem to break a sweat. Like he'd done it 1,000 times before." Gary leaned in, his eyes scanning the room to make sure no one was listening. "I think we might have all underestimated him. There's more to that guy than we know." Clara considered this for a moment before speaking. "You think he's some kind of hero? That maybe he's done this kind of thing before?" Gary shook his head slowly. "Not just a hero. I think he's someone who's had to fight for his life a lot more than we realize. He might not talk about it, but he's got a history. A history that's probably a lot darker than any of us are ready to hear." Clara took a deep breath. "You're right. He's not the kind of man who brags about his past, but I can tell you this: he's someone who doesn't want to be seen as a hero. He wants to be left alone. And I think, after everything that happened, that's the one thing we should respect the most." Gary nodded, his gaze turning thoughtful. "I agree. He's a quiet hero, the kind we don't always notice until we need him the most." Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the neighborhood settled, but Jack's presence lingered like an unspoken promise. People still exchanged stories about the day the bikers had come, but the tales were no longer ones of fear or confusion. They were stories of admiration. Jack had been the one to stand up when no one else could, the one who had protected them without asking for anything in return. It wasn't long before other residents began to reach out to Jack in small ways. A neighbor who had always kept to himself invited Jack over for a game of chess. Another woman, a mother of two, brought over a plate of freshly baked cookies as a gesture of thanks. These were small acts, but they meant something. They were the town's way of acknowledging the fact that Jack wasn't just a quiet neighbor. He was the one they could count on when things went south. The local kids, especially, had begun to look up to him. They had heard the stories, and they wanted to know more. They wanted to hear about the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, and the lessons he had learned. Jack didn't often oblige them with stories. But every now and then, when one of the kids would sit beside him on his porch, he would share a few words that were simple yet profound. "You don't need to fight to prove who you are," he'd say, his eyes gazing out over the quiet street. "The real fight is keeping your head when everything around you is falling apart. And sometimes, the hardest fight is the one you don't even see coming." And so, as time passed, Jack Mercer became something of a legend in the neighborhood, not for his past, but for the quiet strength and integrity he brought to the present. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He wasn't looking for accolades or recognition. But in a world that often overlooked the quiet ones, Jack had shown everyone that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who don't need the spotlight. And as for the bikers, they never returned. Perhaps they had learned a lesson that day, a lesson about underestimating the quiet man in the corner. And as Jack sat on his porch, sipping his drink and watching the sunset, he knew that if they ever did come back, he would be ready. But for now, his work was done. Peace had been restored. As the sun sank lower in the sky, painting the clouds with shades of orange and pink, the peacefulness of the evening seemed to wash over the neighborhood. Jack sat back down in his chair, his gaze lingering on the fading light. He took a slow sip from his drink, his expression calm, as though the events of the day had never happened. Around him, the barbecue that had once been filled with tension slowly returned to life. The sounds of children playing, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of conversation filled the air once more. People had resumed their small talk, their laughter returning as if nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. But something had changed. In the wake of the bikers' departure and the quick resolution brought about by Jack's actions, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt different. There was a new respect in the air, a quiet admiration for the man who had, without hesitation, stepped up when it mattered most. No one had expected Jack to be the one to stop the bikers. In fact, most of them hadn't even known his true nature until that moment. As the sun finally slipped behind the horizon, casting the sky in deeper hues of blue and purple, the crowd continued to buzz with energy, but there was an unspoken understanding that Jack had done more than just defend the peace. He had taught them something without ever saying a word. The quietest person in the room, Jack had always been. The one who sat back and observed, never drawing attention to himself. He wasn't the type to tell stories or seek the spotlight. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. And yet, when the moment called for it, he had acted decisively, showing everyone around him what it truly meant to stand up for what was right. It wasn't about violence or aggression. It wasn't about being the biggest or the toughest. It was about knowing when to step in and when to remain calm, about using the strength that came not just from muscles but from a lifetime of experiences. Jack's story, like the lives of so many quiet people, was never loud or flashy. It wasn't a story that needed to be told in grand gestures or dramatic speeches. It was a story of resilience, of choosing peace when violence would have been easy, of quietly watching the world and making sure that it was safe for others. The kind of story that didn't need to be told out loud because everyone who needed to understand it could see it in the way Jack moved, in the way he stood, and in the way he handled himself when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. As the evening stretched on and the last remnants of the barbecue wound down, people started to trickle away. The kids ran in and out of the houses, calling out to each other, their faces still lit with the joy of the day. The adults, now in smaller groups, exchanged polite goodbyes. But even as they left, there was a shared thought in their minds. They all knew now, Jack Mercer wasn't just a neighbor. He was the quiet backbone of the community, the one who would be there when things went wrong, the one they could rely on, no matter what. Some people are loud and demand attention. They walk into a room and immediately make their presence known. Others prefer to sit in the background, watching, learning, waiting. They don't need to announce who they are because their actions speak for them. And when the time comes, they step forward without hesitation. Their quiet strength, the calm confidence they carry, becomes more powerful than any words they could say. Jack Mercer was one of those people. And in a world that often seemed filled with noise and chaos, that kind of quiet strength was exactly what was needed. Sometimes, the loudest stories are not the ones shouted from the rooftops or displayed for the world to see. Sometimes, the loudest stories are the ones told in the way a person lives their life, the choices they make, the things they do when no one is watching, and the way they handle the hardest moments with dignity and grace. As the last guests left and the quiet of the evening settled in, Jack stood, stretched his legs, and slowly made his way back into his house. There were no celebrations, no grand speeches. He didn't need them. He knew what mattered. He had already done what he needed to do, and he had done it without seeking anyone's approval or recognition. That was the way Jack operated. In the years that followed, the neighborhood would continue to remember the day the bikers had come. But it wasn't the chaos or the violence that people would remember. It wasn't the loud threats or the intense moments of danger. What people would remember was the calm that Jack had brought with him in the face of it all. They would remember how, in a world full of noise, he had chosen to act with quiet confidence. They would remember how he didn't need to raise his voice or demand attention. He had simply done what was necessary, and in doing so, he had shown them all a different kind of strength, a strength that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. The quiet ones often have the loudest stories to tell. They may not tell them with words, but their actions speak louder than any shout. And when the time comes to stand up, they'll be ready, even if no one expects it. For Jack Mercer, the battle was over. But his story would live on in the way the neighborhood looked at him now, with respect, with admiration, and with the quiet understanding that sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't have to say a word to make their presence known. And so, as the world around him carried on, Jack simply sat back, taking in the quiet of the evening, content in the knowledge that he had done his part. The quiet hero had acted, and now, it was time for him to simply enjoy the peace he had fought to protect. The sun had set, but the light of Jack's quiet strength would shine on, in the hearts of those who knew what he had done. And sometimes, that's all that really matters.